Simon Lockrey, who's just going to set up now, is a designer, engineer and an academic. He is a research fellow here at RMIT University, and I'm not going to say too much about that because I think he'll talk a little bit about what he does at RMIT at the beginning of his talk. I did just want to acknowledge the enormous amount of work that Simon has done in helping set up Automotive Historians Australia this year. He's been incredibly creative and energetic in doing all sorts of things with us, including designing and building our website, doing all the organisation for the conference in terms of the digital stuff, but generally being a fantastically energetic ideas man and tireless and continually cheerful, which is remarkable, I think. So I just wanted to acknowledge that on behalf of all of us and our jokes and embarrass him thoroughly. Simon is going to speak today on automotive industry influence on contemporary Australian design practice.
Thanks, Helen. So I thought I'd just put some context as to why I'm actually interested in this conference at all. Because I'm not really a car guy, I suppose. I'm a design guy, but not a car guy. I've designed lots of things in various industries over my sort of 15-year design career. And in my academic career, I really am researching contexts where it is more about research for design rather than research of design itself. So a lot of our projects are based on the transition with sustainability issues, the policy implications, changes of supply chain and new technologies. And the Centre for Design has really been at the forefront of that for 25 years. And certainly its transition to the Centre for Design and Society and now its absorption into D-Lab, the key design lab in this school, School of Architecture and Design at RMIT. So really my interest here is design practice and how automotive really fits into that. So as we know, we've heard a lot about the history of automobiles the last 2 days. So really automobiles do perform this key function of transportation, yet as we've heard, there is this transcendence in a number of areas which scholars have studied, whether it's our conceptions of gender, emotion, cultural values. In Australia, owning a car became a part of the national narrative as a rite of passage to the great Australian dream, probably also echoing the great American dream in the 50s and beyond. So, for a century, the automotive sector really has helped shape the economic, social, political, cultural and vocational landscape of Australia, and design has been a centrepiece of that industry. So what is design as a practice? Well, Herbert Simon has a notion of designer that is the change agent of existing situations into preferred ones. Tim Brown describes design practices involving the solving of complex problems, and I think certainly Penny touched on that definition earlier. Sean describes design as a continuous fly on the wall reflection in action, or on the fly, reflection in action. Swan describes design as a synthesis of intuition, inspirational guesswork and holistic thinking. And although I'm not always on the same page as Ken Friedman, I actually really do like this quote he is an eminent design scholar, I must admit. This quote of his, the practice of design as a thing that people do predates professions. In fact, the practice of design, making things with a useful goal in mind, actually predates the human race. Making things is one of the attributes that made us human in the first place. A very interesting quote, and I think something that obviously connects the human condition even to design practice. So there is clearly a design legacy in Australia connected to automotive. So a sophisticated and organised local design community developed with the international brands, and there's a few in the room that cultivated that from various roles all the way to the top of those teams. Design, engineering and manufacturing expertise were created. Whole secondary and tertiary industries, top tier through to lower tier manufacturing and service industries developed over time. International travel roles ensued, and the latest of those, I think, which is probably the most high profile, is Mike, who's been mentioned a few times today. So as a practice, design has been really integral on how automotive has innovated, evolved, and now, ultimately, and previously, transforming as an industry. But here's the rub. By 2017, we will cease to make cars here. And I think there was a couple of points early in one of the earlier presentations. Global economic factors, reduced political support, union interventions. Currency could probably be thrown in there as well at the time of Abbott's sort of decision, and industry-wide transitions and restructuring. So there's future propositions that have been done by various people, including one of our former premiers here in Victoria. Industries diversifying, local manufacturing ceasing, a rise in service economies, and the ripple effects, which really go to the core of my title of this paper. So what does that mean, and what kind of research questions sit within this from a design practice perspective? And sort of what I wanted to pull out with this paper was the fact that there's been an acknowledgement from federal government through to state, through to even industry groups saying we need to reflect on this period. We need to reflect on what the value is that was, and we'll keep going. But there's been little real reflection on, or at least academic reflection on, what the design roles in the automotive industry have contributed to design more broadly in different industries across different sectors. So really, those two key research questions are what I wanted to explore with this, which is what are the unique skills that designers developed in the automotive industry, the local industry, and their travel outside to broader and global industry. And where did Australian automotive sector play a part in designers transitioning into other industries? I am borrowing a few of Norm's pictures from his collection, by the way, but I acknowledge that as well. So I set this research up, and it's only a preliminary study, it's a qualitative piece of work where clearly I've set up a proposition there based on the past literature and the context of this industrial condition. The research, the empirical research, was really a range of stakeholder interviews, and I'm not going to go through every point on that slide, but the key points here are every major manufacturer at the closure of the industry by 2017 is covered, from young designers that only spent a short time in the industry through to people who spent decades, people who headed up design departments, individual design departments, and also one contemporary of Leo and Paul sitting in the room, a head of design of one of those major companies as well. We also included someone who was quite high up in a top tier manufacturer. What I did with this paper was very much a qualitative and descriptive analysis of their perceptions about the research questions that I prepared them. That descriptive analysis really gave me a lens to pull out key themes that were emerging as these people were describing their experience of the skills, of the context, and what that actually did contribute to design more generally. And four themes really emerged that I think fitted with the theme. So the influence of large and global organisations, the collaboration and the management aspects, the value of investment in research and development, and a contribution to innovation skills. Now there was another theme which was very clear. All participants did actually mention this. The death of the industry, the manufacturing industry as they knew it, was a key theme that was quite prominent. But I thought I would leave that for another time in another paper, because I think it wasn't as connected to what I was trying to convey. Now there are going to be quotes at the top. I won't go into the quotes, but I'll go into the points. So at the first point, there was this feeling that the exposure to international manufacturers and markets really was a knowledge builder for these people in their roles. In-depth knowledge of how things were made and how much things cost, and also really the connection of those two things was really key. This combined to develop advanced skills that they thought was something distinctly automotive, and something that they thought maybe wasn't as pronounced when they went into wider industries, design consultancies, and say appliance companies, etc. Some actually use this knowledge as a differentiator when they go into new roles, and it's seen as valuable by their new employers. Others are heavily involved in manufacturing negotiations because their ability to know what things cost and how things are made, probably better than some of their colleagues that haven't had that experience. So, in fact, more robust costing processes have been implemented by some of these interviewees in their new roles that none of these companies had ever considered, really drawing upon their experience with Toyota and Holden and Ford. And also the top tier manufacturer who had to deal a lot with the pressures of the tensions between manufacturing and brand. And then also the global exposure provided by the advanced production knowledge. On the same theme, it was probably the most dense theme that I got my teeth into in terms of these interviews. There was also a really socially based sort of construction of their perceptions around the fact that they had the ability to deal with different cultures in making deals and working to common goals. And that was both internally, the teams they work in, and the teams or companies they work with, the externalities of their context. So they started to actually build, particularly two of them who worked a lot in China, seemed to be able to articulate this understanding of business ethics, of foreign business ethics, and by foreign I mean foreign to their own understanding of business ethics from their previous sort of experience, rather than nationality based, and an ability to negotiate and be sensitive to those contexts. The cultural diversity of teams at automotive organisations was pronounced. One of them called it a melting pot at the particular organisation they were working at in Melbourne, a melting pot of cultural diversity and nationalities, different languages. Interestingly, English was the common language spoken even when they went to other countries. I'm talking predominantly American-based companies. I didn't get a notion of Japan so much with the Toyota participant. There was skill also in creating and checking that a common understanding was present. And I think this actually touches on a lot of design management literature, where there is an understanding that when there is not a common understanding and a common language between internal and external players, that you do get breakdowns in that design process. But it seemed like all of them understood that point and independently, without prompting, articulated that. In terms of collaboration and management, non-automotive industries, from their experience moving from automotive to, say, design consultancy to appliance manufacture, furniture manufacture and built environment, seemed more insular, less willing to go out and actually seek and engage with stakeholders, which was interesting because I think there's a perception with non-automotive design people that actually automotive is very insular. And that's anecdotal, that's from my own experience. I don't think that, I just know that's what people say when they often, I suppose, characterise automotive, when they stereotype automotive design roles. But it makes sense that it's not like that, because the amount of collaborative skills you need to make the most complex product that a product designer can work on work. And again, that theme, or that terminology, the most complex product, the ultimate product was another way someone described it that you can work on in your design career. That came up again and again in terms of their reflection on working in automotive. So global projects really required management to be core, and certainly the executive level participant in these interviews described it as strategic design. Designing for a period of time and the allocation of resources over the project's lifespan and beyond into the service life of the product and the testing that certainly Leo has touched on a few times in his comments. The adaptation of strategy in their current roles is something that seems pronounced. In fact, one of the participants has been employed specifically because of their strategic skills and the inability of their current employer to successfully integrate strategic design previously, and that's from the directors of this organisation down. It was something they just cannot get their head around. This person has a lot of management training, a lot of experience with big international projects. Particularly that participant and another participant talked about better being able to distill product and articulate the competitive advantage of design over time. And the other person I was referring to is actually now working in the food industry and rolling out essentially Toyota type strategies, design strategies and manufacturing and supply chain processes in this big, I'm talking about top 2 food companies in the world, big. And surprisingly, they don't have this stuff I found that very surprising, actually, that this brand did not have the kind of sophistication with the processes that this person was actually adapting or implementing. This is probably for me, the most interesting was this value of investment in research and development. The investment in research and development was seen in their new roles as not as high a priority as in these new sectors that previous automotive designers were moving into. Depth, understanding, detail and refinement required over many years for one automotive project was key. So it was a risk not to do this stuff. Whereas I suppose the tension or the flip side, the juxtaposition of new roles in, say, for instance, most pronouncedly in industrial design consulting, was that design consultants are lean, smart, fast and cash sensitive. So projects in non-automotive seemed like some of these people that they weren't given the time or the resources to adequately achieve expectations, and I'm sure that could be something to do with the fact they were used to that already with their previous experience in well-resourced big projects. Interestingly though, some of those projects in these companies are still 2-year projects, 3-year pipelines like you do often get in an automotive type design context. So over-servicing a job is perceived as a major risk in consultancies, but in automotive it was a bigger risk not to invest. So this advanced expertise in balancing investment, design, reliability and reducing product costs seems to be something that was prevalent in all of the discussions that occurred between these participants, and they valued that, and whenever they could apply that in their new roles they would do that, even if it meant that there was a resistance to that. Also, a key point was that automotive draws on knowledge from a wide range of fields. So there were often subject experts within automotive companies, specific drivetrain, braking, chassis, trim, all of these different departments, and they'd often become subject experts themselves and sort of work on a career in a particular area or sort of go to management. So this access to internal expertise internally at new organisations, it was rarer, they thought. One mentioned that going to a major appliance company, there was a lot of the expertise they found in the automotive company internally, but then there seemed to be a much bigger resistance to collaborate with their external parties, their manufacturers outside of this global appliance manufacturer. So sort of this collaboration aspect seemed to be something they highly valued after their experience after working in automotive. So this internal expert ecology structure, seemed like the automotive organisations did it well and was particularly lacking in smaller, faster, leaner sort of outfits. And the propensity to seek expert advice was still there for these people. They still did it even if there was a culture of it not happening. In fact, some of them were mentoring some of their new colleagues in that. And finally, the final point is this contribution to innovation skills. So automotive really requires, in Australian condition, really require this really unique set of contextual things: vast landmass, coastal capital cities, multicultural demographic shifts, and a small market. And we just heard from Norm about having to basically deal with what you had and innovate based on the fact that you are in this small market and having to deal with all of these crazy conditions. So automotive designers had to be smart with what they had. New products, materials, manufacturing, design capacity developed inside and outside these organisations, and certainly the executive that I talked about a project where they developed a technology, a polymer technology, mixed with a particular item on the car, an area of the car, that the company they developed it with went on and they commercialised that in a range of other industries internationally, and it made them as an organisation, it made them. And that I've heard that story repeated again and again with materials, products, parts. It really had a serious effect on innovation in Australia, no matter what someone tells you that they didn't. Whether it is a material up to whole product or city-based sort of context. Global mobility opened the agency in well-resourced and regarded international projects, even though there was a juxtaposition in some of the discussions around the fact that some of them thought that they were constricted in innovation because of that sort of particularly small market and less resources than their more well-resourced counterparts in Detroit or in Japan. But many of these people went overseas and they actually got access to bigger projects and more resources, and one in particular talked about how that made their career. And one in particular said, interestingly, that this person doesn't like to be constricted in anything they do now in their design projects. They run their own consultancy. They're highly successful now in the built environment, so more in building and architecture and interiors, and they just push back. They negotiate, they still collaborate, but they stick to their design principles based on what they had to deal with in automotive to try and keep the design intent of their projects. So the limitations to this research, this is a preliminary piece of research. This is only conducted with 4 in-depth interviews of 6 that I engage. It's a high percentage of interviews conducted, but it's a small sample. What this gave us, though, is really this rich insight into what potentially are some of the key points that these people are developing and taking into industry. It's certainly not a generalised type of study. It is a preliminary piece of qualitative research. Almost, I suppose, if we talk about Laura's presentation yesterday and mine, it's almost the counter opposite, and maybe I then need to go to where Laura's gone in terms of my next piece of research, which is where I'll finish sort of, areas for further research. It really does form this basis to tease out some of these key insights. Maybe it's about looking at what people who never went to automotive think about these key points, and more people who were in automotive, and see what the difference is. Maybe it's about just doing a much more general study, a more quantitative study across industries and look at particular sectors. But really what this has started to identify is the value of the skills that these designers bring who've been in automotive, how their roles may actually enhance current and future industries, and what more general trends may be evident in automotive designers influencing design practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So I found that a hugely stimulating and a hugely timely topic. Some questions? There are some.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, when you selected the stakeholders to interview, how did you connect that to the stakeholders theory in order to select them? And when you interviewed them, did you make any relationship with respect to the psychological literature, as you talked about the perceptions and so on?
No, it certainly didn't connect it to stakeholder theory, and really this is almost a grounded theory piece of work. So it's about anchoring it in the literature around design practice and seeing what emerged as a qualitative piece of descriptive analysis. I think in a more structured piece of work, I would certainly go towards maybe something like stakeholder theory if I was investigating those collaboration. In fact, the third theme, for instance, I think the third theme, if I was to do a bigger study, I'd have to anchor it to that. Psychological frames and cognitive frames could be a really interesting way, I think, of analysing this at a very micro level. Probably less so if I went broad again. I could probably anchor it in cognitive frames and then do a broad study and just try and link it back. But I think those are both very interesting areas that actually applies to a whole lot of my other research as well that I'm starting to explore. So didn't do that, but I think it would be very interesting to do that, particularly with some of those key points that came out from their discussion, because there's clearly a lot going on in the way that they're structuring their thoughts and the content of those thoughts in how this is actually playing out. There were key themes that all of them said the same thing without any kind of prompting or guiding, which was interesting. because these are people who are like between the ages of. So in terms of the sample, I wanted to choose broadly across all of the brands, so I wasn't brand specific. So I wanted breadth of industry. Tier 1, I wanted people who are young, who are executives, so it went across all of the sort of the job progression rather than be targeted. Maybe next time it's about finding out what they also think across their careers, maybe. So, yeah. It almost started more questions than it answered this piece of work. Yeah. Which is good, that means there's lots more research.
I've got a very quick question for you, Simon. Did you think of asking the employers of these former automotive industry design workers or their new colleagues what they thought they brought to the new roles?
Not for this piece, but I think that, like I mentioned with that last answer, I think that, actually prior to the answer at the end of the presentation, I think the comparison of perspective of their new sort of colleagues versus particularly who have not worked in automotive versus what these people perceive, I think that would actually be a very nice way of particularly linking it to stakeholder theory, for instance, and cognitive sort of theories as well. I am tending to think that may be where I might go next, and bigger, because this is a small project.
Hey Simon, you mentioned that there were issues with communication worldwide, and everybody kind of recognises those communication issues. How about from a cultural perspective? Did anybody talk about different cultural approaches to design, and then talk about how some of those cultural differences?
Specifically, and there's again, because we've only got sort of 28 minutes whatever to do the presentation. Check out the paper. There's a few mini stories around that where one person in particular, who is now located overseas in another country, so they've actually taken this to another level. They've chosen to immigrate somewhere else. Said that basically their experience in the melting pot helped them become more sensitive to other cultures and the way they approached not only design but life, and it was life affirming and formative in their lives outside design and in design, and I think they're almost reflecting on them growing as a person through some of those discussions. And I think actually 3 out of the 4, I'd say, more so than one of the participants, touched on that and elaborated with their different interpretation of what that meant for their own. But the one I just described was the most interesting to me. Was like formative. But that's always going to be different for each person.
We've got time for one more quick question if there is one. Coffee? One more question.
What emerged quite clearly from this presentation was a sort of a culture of corporatization, in a sense that in some way reflects also the global organizations in themselves. And I was wondering if in this corporatization type of underlying culture that emerged, there were something really innovative or really creative that emerged from the interview of these people that clearly identify the design part or their specific skills in contributing to this value.
So I'd say the most, and I don't know, Paul and Leo in particular might be able to comment on this as well. The most striking thing that every single participant almost forced down my throat from the start without me opening my mouth was, we get how things cost and how you make stuff, and we know that better than any other industry, and when we get out there we just don't understand. Well, we do understand why, but don't understand why they haven't had this sort of cultural learning experience around manufacturing and costing. And it was so like explicit. It's a personal perspective. Working at Dyson, when automotive people came in, that was their like absolute key skill that just cleaned that company up over a period of 5 years. Like the head of manufacturing came from Bosch, and then they brought in a McLaren engineer to design all the digital motors. And these people knew better than any person in that business how things were made and how you could actually get that thing to be commercially viable. I think for me, that was the key thing that emerged. Didn't emerge actually, it smashed me in the face.
On that note, please thank me again, join me in thanking Simon.